Well, welcome to Tales of the Times. We are looking at a piece of Clay County history. We are joined today by Clay County Historical Society President Mike White. And we are going to be taking a look at the 100-Year War. Now, I went on to Google, and anybody can do this. And you know how Google has been powered by AI now, Gemini. I type into Google, what is the bloodiest feud in American history? And here's what AI tells me. It says, the Clay County War, also known as the Baker-Howard feud, is widely considered the bloodiest family feud in American history, with an estimated 150 lives lost. This conflict in Kentucky, which spanned nearly a century, involved multiple families competing for resources and dominance, especially in the lucrative salt mining industry. While the Hatfield-McCoy feud is infamous and well known, the Clay County War's longer duration and higher casualty count make it a stronger contender for the title of bloodiest. So that's the preface that I have for this piece of history. So we just want to preliminarily explore what this is. Because I know for a fact, while I was in school, they didn't talk about this. But this is an important piece of history, not just Clay County history, but American history. So we want, as Clay Countians, we're going to shed light on this. And in this episode, you're going to get to hear a general rundown of the Howard-Baker feud, the 100-Year War. And please stick around because I have a special surprise for you after this preliminary rundown with the Historical Society president. So if you could you just start out by telling us how this began? What the basis of it is, and why that it continued for so long.
Well, Clay County history, we've had many feuding factions and families over our history since we became a county in 1807, and many of those involved subjects such as politics, business, land acquisitions, as you might imagine, but several different reasons why that feuding was prevalent. And back then we were a very large county, and there wasn't that many law enforcement agencies, if any at all, and so disagreements were settled many times with guns. And most of our natives here are of Scotch-Irish descent. They're quick to temper, and so all those factors together created a feuding faction, if you will, and this involved many different families from many different parts of our county, and unfortunately it's the thing that many people away from here knew us for and what we became famous for, when actually a lot of that was sensationalized, but we do have the title, or we are known for having the bloodiest feud in U.S. history. It actually makes the Hatfield-McCoy looks like a slingshot fight or something. So, but we have long been a feuding faction, feuding people, and unfortunately back then that's the way that things were settled many times, and that's unfortunately what we were known for a lot back during those days.
So take us back. It's the 1800s. Who were these families? Why did they start feuding?
Well, our county was founded, we had what was known as the Cattle Wars, which was a little bit prior to us, to our county being formed, and those things were very violent and actually started us as a feuding people. Later on, several dominant families in Clay County became known for their feuding involvement. Some of these families were the White family, the Baker family, the Howard family, the Garrett family. Later on, the Beans family, Philpotts, Griffins, many different factions involved in feuding in our county over the next 100 years, up to around maybe the 1920s or 30s. Things would die down for a while, and then an incident would happen, and someone would be killed, and next thing you know, there's several others killed, all in relation to families that you may have sided with one way or another. And lots of people felt back then that you were forced to be on one side or the other side. You couldn't get away from the feud, and so that resulted in a lot of innocent people being killed simply because they had to choose sides. But many families involved, and it happened over a long period of time, and thankfully those days are over.
So we think. So, name us just a few of the important figures from the earlier times of the feud, because as you mentioned, this is it's a feud that lasted for a long time. Things starting up and dying down. You could call it an episodic type war. So in the beginning, towards the first part, because I don't want to get straight into the most famous names from the feud, but what are just a few of the events that happened during the cattle wars?
Well, let's move on up and start involving some of these families that later on became famous for their feud involvement. Early 1840s, there was a representative of the Garrett family and a representative of the White family running for state office, senator, I believe. Obviously, there was a lot of friction, and there was a lot of trouble over that election and the families that were involved. And so it's referred to as the Baker-Howard feud, but it could be called the Garrett-White feud, the Garrett-Howard feud, the Baker-White feud. Could be any of those factions. For the most part, the Howards and the Whites were together, and the Bakers and the Garretts were together. And so if you take those four families and then families who were associated on one side or the other, all of a sudden you've got a large number of the county's population who feel one way or another as far as these conflicts are concerned. But that was in the early 1840s. In the mid 1840s, we had an episode where Daniel Bates, local landowner, was killed by Abner Baker Jr. Abner Baker Jr. was married to Susan White, and so there's some more names again from these prominent families that were involved in a major episode, and murder trial evolved from that. We have at the Historical Society the entire trial in book form. That's a very popular read for a lot of historians. But those are two prominent things that happened during the 1840s. And then, of course, you can move on up to the early 1890s when there was a timber dispute between the Howards and the Bakers. That evolved into Deputy Sheriff Will White being murdered. That evolved into Tom Baker being killed because he was accused of killing Will White. And so when these episodes came up, one thing led to another, led to this trial, that trial, state militia being involved, just various and several things that just created a hostile atmosphere while they were going on.
And for some of this, you have images, and there's images of, Tom Baker, while there's state militia at the courthouse, and there's bullet holes in the courthouse. What was it? You said it was 3 to 5 minutes before he died. He was photographed.
We have, and those are in several of those photographs are in the Clay We Were, A Visual Journey, the book that we published at the Historical Society. But I guess the iconic picture is the one of Tom Baker standing outside his tent with the state militia guard who looks like a young teenager. And supposedly the reporter from the Courier-Journal took this photograph only minutes before Baker was shot from across the street out of Sheriff Will White's house. So that photograph is in the book, as are many others. But very, very interesting, and very you can get really in depth into these stories if you really want to research.
Mm. So we go from the 1890, the wood, the logging episode, and we step into the salt mining, or the governor?
It's already happened.
The governor will be 1899. But
So that's okay.
The governor really is not anything to do with our feuds here, but
Right.
one of the persons involved in the feud. And by the way, AI is wrong. There was no such thing as salt mines.
Well, there you go.
Salt was derived from our water. They drilled water wells. When the water came to the top of the ground, they piped it through hollow logs into kettles, built the fire under the kettles. When the water evaporated, salt was left. 1 gallon of our water would produce 4 ounces of salt. So salt was from our water and not from mines.
It's actually salt. I guess they called it salt works, didn't they?
They call them salt works or salt furnaces.
Yeah.
You need to have a lot of these kettles, maybe a dozen kettles, 2 rows, 6 in each row or 8 in each row. Fire underneath and a chimney at the end to keep the fire going, keep it hot. And of course they used the slave labor. They pipe the water into the kettles, boil it, and when the evaporation happened,
You have salt.
you'd have salt. This area of southeastern Kentucky and the southwestern corner of the state of Virginia had the saltiest water in the country. Matter of fact, there's a small town in Virginia called Saltville. So this area was known for its briny water. That's why Clay County was formed. The state legislature made sure that there was a road into what would become Clay County to get the salt out of here to the bluegrass region and to other states. Mm-hmm. That's how valuable it was. There was no refrigeration. Everybody had to have salt. And so it was traded back and forth as a commodity. It was sold by the bushel, barrel, or pound. It was what made our county from basically early 1800 up to the Civil War. Our county was rich, and the people who produced the salt were rich because of that natural resource.
Well, in fact, it was even, wasn't that true that some of the buffalo right here above where we are today, there was a salt leak where they would.
That's how they settled in this area. First it was the buffalo, and the areas where the salt water was the briniest, it would form salt deposits.
Really?
And it'd be on top, near the top of the ground. Scrape the dirt away, well, the buffalo would find it. When it was close to the top of the ground, the buffalo would find it, sniff around, and they'd lick the salt. Mm-hmm. Well, guess who followed the buffalo? The Indians, the hunters.
Right.
All right? Whoever followed the hunters eventually settled here. Mm-hmm. And so that's how the salt became prominent, is because buffalo found the salt, Indians followed the buffaloes, settlers followed the Indians, and created settlements and civilization.
We're now moving into other things that we want to discuss with you in the
Yeah,
future.
really.
So, like we said, one story leads to another.
Which is true with everything, especially even with our other clients. When we're talking about one thing, we go off, we get into an actual bit of history or an actual little bit that we didn't know, and then we have to, well, we don't have to, but they fall back into what we were already talking about, and then there we are.
Yeah.
So I guess the biggest hook, anyhow, is the part of this feud. I don't even know if I want to call it a feud when it went on for so long. It's like a war. they call it a war.
Yeah.
So what is actually more accurate?
More referred to when families are involved, it's called feuding.
Okay.
Families or individuals, a war involves armies.
Right.
This is more personal, individual families settling disputes with one another through fighting, and that's called a feud.
Mm-hmm.
So it's more individual and family related than when you say
Feuding.
a war, you're usually talking about armies.
Mm. So there, and I've been just tiptoeing around it, but there is an obvious part of this story, and that is where there was a governor, and the governor's story got tied into the story of the feud without me going any further into it. So could you just give a brief highlighting of the governor's tie-in to this story?
Well, the assassination of Governor Goebel has Clay County ties because of Big Jim Howard, a Clay Countyan. He was on trial. He was accused and actually spent prison time for the assassination of Governor Goebel. Governor Goebel was a Democratic candidate for governor in 1898, and William Taylor was the Republican candidate. Of course, most of eastern Kentucky was Republican. Governor Goebel was assassinated in front of the old Capitol. He had been elected. He was assassinated, and then while he was on his deathbed, was sworn in as governor. He actually lived a few days before passing away, and then different people were charged with the crime, one of which being James Ballard Howard, Big Jim Howard of Clay County. And it was a very tumultuous time in state history. Hundreds and hundreds of Republican voters rode the trains to Frankfort. They were outraged because there was a disputed votes in the election. They thought the election had been stolen for the Democrat Goebel, and so they were outraged. And so Frankfort was in turmoil and upheaval, and of course it led to and culminated with the assassination of Governor Goebel. But our connection here is the Clay County native, Big Jim Howard, and his association, trial and actual prison time for the assassination of the governor. He was eventually pardoned for the crime, as were the others involved, but it definitely had an Eastern Kentucky connection. Governor Goebel was shot from the Secretary of State's office, who was Caleb Powers, and he was from Barberville, Knox County. So things pertaining to the assassination of Governor Goebel have a Republican / Eastern Kentucky shade to them for sure.
Oh boy.
That was great. You did a good job with that one.
Yeah. Gosh, it doesn't even seem right, Just going back and think this, you'd never know that this stuff happened here.
So that was in 1899.
Yes.
But the actual feud doesn't end until...
Well, there were people who were killed up to the 1930s.
Okay.
And so people like to associate that with the feuds, and that makes it sound better that it was 100-year war or whatever.
Yeah.
But there were people killed who were members of the families associated with the feuding from prior years.
Okay.
So that's how they tie it all together and just say that it's all because of that.
Gotcha. Okay.
So any major events after 1899, other than, the multiple murders on either side of either families, any major events?
Well, there was a lot of local episodes.
Mm-hmm.
Their politics was always involved. Elections were always heated. These families were always involved and had their candidate versus a candidate from the other side most of the time. And so just as elections are heated today, they were heated back then also. And
But with shootouts.
a whole lot less law enforcement.
Yeah.
And sometimes you add a little bit of whiskey to that, and then you've got somebody killing somebody.
You're right.
And so I don't know if you'd call them major episodes, but several people lost their lives because of the feelings and the factions and the families that were associated with these episodes.
Mm-hmm. Well, now that was an awesome, an excellent introduction.
Very good. Perfect.
Because we will be visiting in future episodes. I don't know, we'll probably call it a mini-series where we just visit the story of the Baker Howard feud with the Clay County Historical Society. So I want to thank the Historical Society President, Mike White, for joining us today. We will be visiting them shortly, and you can look forward to that. But I promised a special surprise. And if you will stick around, we have a member of the Howard family that would like to share her historical insights about this feud. Welcome back to Tales of the Times. I am joined by my grandmother, who is Beverly Sue Howard Stevens, and she is going to be sharing with us her insights and historical context around the 100-Year War, the Baker Howard feud, an important piece of history from our county, and I'm going to let her take it away with her introduction.
Well, first I guess the thing is to explore the lineage. I've been an amateur genealogist since I was in high school. I always loved the history and to find all the facts. And I have been able to trace our family line back to Robert the Bruce in Scotland and William the Conqueror. And on down that line, the first Howards of our line to come into the United States, which was at the time colonial UK, was Edward Howard and two of his brothers, James and John. And their father was the Earl of Arundel. But they weren't the oldest son, so they were not going to inherit the title. So they decided to seek their fortune in another way, and they came to America. Then on down the line after that, the Revolutionary War started. And so one of their descendants, Samuel Howard, who lived in Virginia at the time, and he served under General Washington. Now, family lore says that when Cornwallis surrendered to Washington and he gave the British flag over, that Samuel is the one that he reached it to.
Oh my gosh.
That's what they say. But anyway, they didn't have money in the brand new little country because they had never collected taxes. All the taxes had been paid to England. So they really couldn't pay their soldiers. But they had a choice. They could wait and collect some pay later on when there was tax revenue coming in, or they could take a land grant west of the Appalachian Mountains because they were ready to expand. And so Samuel took a land grant, and his grant was what is now Harlan, Kentucky. And they have the deed on record there at the courthouse in Harlan where he gave his property to be the city of Harlan. It was actually called Mount Pleasant in the beginning, but there was another Mount Pleasant somewhere else. And the post office wouldn't let you have two of the same name towns, so they had to give it some other name. They called it Harlan. And then Samuel goes on down and has a grandson by the name of Adrian Ballard Howard. And Adrian was a logger. And what he did, he would buy tracts of land and take the timber off, and then he would sell that and take his money and buy another tract. And so he eventually ended up in Clay County as he moved along through tracts of land. And when he got to Clay County, he bought a piece of property from Boston Bob Baker. And Boston Bob was the main patriarch of the Baker family here in Clay County at the time. They came to Clay County somewhere between 1860 and 1865. And so they settled down on Crane Creek, where they had bought the property. And their neighbor was Tom Baker. And he was the grandson of Boston Bob. His dad was named George Baldy Baker. Now, by this time, they had begun to have a bit of government here. They had established Manchester as a city. They were beginning to have officers of the court, and so on and so forth. And of course, there were Democrats and there were Republicans. Do you want me to tell you why the Howards were Republicans?
Why is that?
Well, they were anyway to start with, but during the Civil War, Ballard was off fighting with the Union. This area would get, they would have Union troops come through, and they would have Confederate troops come through.
Right.
So my grandmother, Mary Polly, was pregnant, and she had a little wooden chest, and she was making baby clothes, and she would put them in that chest. And so a Confederate group came in to the farm there, and they took the pig and they took the chickens and they ransacked the house and they found that little chest. So one of them comes carrying the chest out and he busted it on the ground to get inside, and all it had in it was baby clothes. And so I guess out of anger or whatever, he ripped the baby clothes up. And so they took their plunder and they were getting ready to leave, and their leader flipped a coin down at her feet and said, go buy you some more baby clothes.
Oh my
But it
gosh.
was a Confederate coin.
Which was worthless.
Which was,
What?
you weren't going to be able to buy anything with that. And they rode away. So she declared that any Howard that would be a Democrat would have to be ostracized from the family.
Oh, well, then there you go.
And so they were always Republicans. But anyway, the way that worked is we had a lot of Democrats statewide, but Clay County was primarily Republican. So you had the people who were Democrats, the most powerful ones of them, or the most wealthy and influential, were the Garretts. General T.T. Garrett was the son of a former governor, and he was in the salt work business. And then you had the Whites, who were also in the salt work business, and they were pretty much the two ruling groups. And the Democrats mostly went for the state offices. They would usually get elected to those, like senator and representative, things like that. And then the Republicans would have the local offices mostly. So time goes by, and in the process, the Bakers were Democrats, so they would align with the Garretts. And the Howards, being Republicans, were aligned with the Whites when they were doing politics. But now, the Baker family married into the Garretts and the Whites and the Howards. So there were connections to everybody. But there was always that little political rivalry. So they would be like, you know, sometimes say mean things to each other or do little mean things to each other, but nothing really, really bad until Abner Baker married Susanna White. And Abner was paranoid in a lot of ways. And he decided that Susanna was cheating on him.
Oh, no.
So the Whites didn't like him for saying ugly things about
Right.
Susanna. And that there was some agitation there. And then he ended up killing Daniel. I'm missing his last name. Bates, maybe. Anyway, he kills him. And they put him on trial. They tried to say he was crazy. As a, you know, don't hang him because he's crazy.
Right.
And they even, actually, he left for a while and spent time in Cuba and Georgia and different places with different family members, but he came back, and when he did, they put him on trial. And they found him guilty, and they hanged him. And so that kind of, the Bakers were really angry now because they killed
Abner.
poor Abner. And so that made them a little more aggressive toward each other. And then time continues to go by, and Tom was Tom Baker, that's Boston Bob's grandson, George Baldy's son.
Yes.
He was fairly influential. He was a school board member. And pretty much nobody got hired as a school teacher unless he said, okay. He was the man for that. And he had like 13 sons, 12 or 13 sons. And he had 12 or 13 brothers. George Baldy had that many sons too. So when they decided to make something happen, they had like 30 men.
Right.
Just their family. And they could pretty much bully if they wanted to or needed to. And then, so Tom, being the neighbor of Ballard Howard, they kind of tried to work together in the timber business, but Tom was always getting a little dig in.
Yeah.
Me personally, I think he didn't like the fact that his papa had sold that land to a Howard.
Okay.
I think he really felt like it was rightfully his, because he would come across the boundary line and cut trees.
So they were both logging right there,
Yeah.
and that land
Right together.
used to belong to Tom Baker's grandfather.
Mm-hmm.
His grandfather sells it to Ballard Howard. So they're logging the same land, and there's already
Yeah.
bad blood between them.
Right. So
Okay.
that kind of escalated later on. Now, during that last part of the 1890s, my grandpa Ballard was sheriff, and Jim was tax assessor. That's his son. And George Baker, Tom Baker's dad, I believe he was county attorney. And then
Now Jim, that's Big Jim.
Big Jim.
Big Jim Howard. James Ballard Howard.
Yes, he was my grandpa's brother. He was the tax assessor.
Okay.
And then Bev White was sheriff after Grandpa Ballard.
Mm-hmm.
He became Sheriff White. 1897, I think, is the election he won it in. Then, so you had some Bakers in the courthouse working right alongside the Howards and the Whites. And then, of course, General T.T. Garrett, he was kind of always in the mix. And so they kind of had a fragile, get along with each other relationship that they could bust out with the slightest provocation. They would break out into some kind of a fight. So that went on
There was trouble very close to the surface.
quite constantly. And then at the end of Grandpa Ballard's term as sheriff, when the auditors came in, it was a Baker that came in from the state to do the audit. And so when he audited, he found him as $40 short on his tax collections, which meant they called it he failed because his books didn't balance. And so he had to pay the $40. And I don't know why. I mean, he had a good working farm. He had the timber business.
Mm-hmm.
And he had been sheriff and he got paid for that. So why he didn't have $40 to pay that debt, I don't know. But
well, perhaps
$40 from the bank.
Oh my
To
gosh.
pay it. And so a little more time goes by.
Mm-hmm.
It's springtime. They're out there logging. And they kind of had some words over Tom coming across the line and cutting some trees.
Mm-hmm.
And while they were out in the logwoods. And then Tom went to town and bought the $40 loan from the bank.
How do you do that?
Apparently you can do that.
Okay. It's 1897.
He paid the bank, and now Ballard doesn't owe the bank anymore. He owes him.
Oh no, that's terrible.
So now they have another quarrel because Ballard's saying, you took this many trees off of my side, and he said, you owe me $40. I'll pay you for your trees when you pay me this $40 you owe me. Which
Oh boy.
So now Ballard's angry too. Everybody's mad.
So Tom went across. I'm looking at a crease in the table here. Tom goes across
Yeah.
the line of their property, and then so Tom buys Ballard's loan, and now they're both okay.
Yeah, so you owe me, I owe you. I
Yes.
did not want to owe you. I owe the bank. I was going to pay the bank when I sold these trees that you took.
Okay.
Because his point in getting it from the bank, he was going to pay it back when he sold the lawn.
Yes.
So they all had.
Well, that is true. Why was he short $40 when he had his hands in so much? But
Yeah, he should have been able to just reach in his pocket and give him $40, but he didn't.
he didn't.
And so it came time to take the rafts. See, they had to wait for the spring rains when the water came up to float the logs from up on Crane Creek down,
All the way, yeah.
down to the river at
Yeah.
Oneida, and then they would go on down to the sawmills and things that they went to, usually to Frankfurt.
Okay.
And so my grandpa, who I never called grandpa, he was always Daddy Howard to me, Israel, was a younger son of Ballard. And he was really good at driving the rafts.
Okay.
So they were putting their rafts together, the bakers were putting their raft together. They had the rafts down at the, tied up, ready to leave the next morning early. Now, I have been told this two different ways, and which one actually is, I don't know, but either way, the rafts got gone.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a lady that ran a little trading post when they got down to below Oneida. They'd stop and take a break and
Yeah.
get something to eat and stuff like that.
Like our gas stations today,
she
but
told one story I've been told is that lady said she saw Tom Baker go by
get the rafts.
with the raft.
Mm-hmm.
And so they were also thinking not only did he cut trees, but he stole the raft.
Mm-hmm.
Now, another story that I have been told is Israel left with the raft, and some of the bakers left with the other raft, but it wasn't Tom.
Mm-hmm.
And either way, the rafts were gone,
And they were mad at Tom.
and they were all mad. So the next day, after Israel supposedly, or however the raft got gone, they went to do some more stuff, and out from the bushes, shots rang out.
Mm.
And so Wilson, my grandpa's brother, Big Jim's brother,
Mm-hmm.
I should back up here. When this fussing started and they were getting really mean about it,
Yes.
and people were getting hurt, Jim, who was tax assessor, and George, who was the county attorney, met at the courthouse, and Jim said, we need to get this, nip this in the bud, more or less. This is gonna get really bad if we don't figure something out. So they kind of did a little arbitration with each other, and they decided, okay, your bunch is gonna do this, and my bunch is gonna do that, and we draw a peace. This is gonna stop.
Mm-hmm.
In the meantime,
Was this George Baker?
yeah,
Okay.
they called him Baldy George.
Okay.
In the meantime, the guys down on Crane Creek don't know anything about this conversation because it was happening
Right.
at
In town,
Manchester
and
in
they're-
the courthouse.
Yeah.
So the Howards are headed home after their day in the logwoods, and shots ring out, and Wilson is dead,
Mm-hmm.
and Bert Stores, which was a nephew, but whose parents had died when he was very small, and Grandpa Bauer had raised him. So he was
Like a
a
son.
nephew, but he was like a son and a brother. They actually shot him in the head, and Grandpa was shot, but he wasn't dead.
Okay.
He was shot, but he wasn't dead. And when he turned to try to go the other way on his horse, he also got shot in the back. And so he ended up, they're all in the road bleeding and dying. And so we've got, let me make sure I say the right name. I should say, as they were on their way up the road just before the shots rang out, and just before they got close to Tom Baker's place, Thena Baker had a dinner bell in her front yard.
Yes.
And as they went by, she rang that bell.
Okay.
And they didn't understand why she ringing the bell now. You know, it's not dinner time. But as soon as they got past her house, and Thena was actually kin to the Howards, but she was married to Tom Baker's cousin,
Okay.
and they were neighbors. And so when they got past her house, that's when the shots rang out from the bushes. So now we know why she rang the bell. But they didn't understand it at the time. And then, so word gets back to Manchester
Mm-hmm.
that the Howards and the Bakers, they've had a killing. They actually thought Ballard was dead too, but he wasn't dead. He was badly injured, but he wasn't dead. And they were afraid to come and get the bodies because of where they were located.
Yeah.
That they couldn't get to them without getting shot. And then, so word gets up to the courthouse. Well, George Baldy has went home and finds out all this has happened. Big Jim gets told they killed your daddy and your brother, and they're laying down there in the road bleeding to death and all this. So he comes, and when he gets down there, there's like 3 different paths he could take to get to his dad's house, but every direction he went, they were shooting at him.
Mm-hmm.
So he'd turn and go this way. They shot him that way. He'd turn and go this way. They shot him that way. So he ended up going back down to the mouth of Crane, I call it, where the little store was that the Cold Irons ran, who were also relatives. And he was there talking to them, and they were catching him up on how everything was. And your dad's not dead, but Wilson's dead, and Bert's dead, and they had told them before they died, they told the people that gathered around that it was Tom and James and I'm going blank on the other name, but they were the ones that did the shooting. And so he's like, well, George made this deal with me, and no sooner than we did, they've attacked my family.
Yeah.
You know? And as they were having this conversation, George comes riding up on his horse.
Oh boy.
He has come he got word and he's there too. And so when he looks around, somebody said something like, well, what's got Baldy George out so early this morning? And he looks around and there he is. And so he grabs his rifle thinking, well, he's coming to kill me.
Yeah.
Because they've been shooting at me all morning. I couldn't
Yeah.
get to the house. And George sees him and goes, he's going to kill me.
He's going to kill me because
So
we've been at war.
he jumps off his horse and grabs his rifle. But he jumped off on the opposite side of the horse from where Jim was.
Yeah.
And they both shoot. And Jim shoots through the horse's neck and hits him in the gut.
Ugh.
And so he's down. And so they take him into the store post office there and call the doctor. And they come down and they cut him open and sew his guts back together and all that. But he ended up dying. So when that happened, Jim leaves and goes to the sheriff, or to, not the sheriff, Beverly's sheriff, Will. He goes to Will's house, which is down at Burning Springs, and surrenders himself to him. Now, in the meantime, they've got Tom Baker is being tried for a different murder.
Mm-hmm.
And burning somebody's house and stuff. And so they're all having to go to court. Well, they, when Will took Jim to town and they, went before the judge, he released him on his own recognizance.
Mm-hmm.
And which made the Bakers extremely more angry than they already were.
Yes.
And so it was just escalating. And so it ends up, while they've got Tom up there to put him on trial for what he's done, he was out, he didn't want to be put in the jailhouse. He said he wouldn't be safe and he would never get to trial that way.
Yeah.
So they sent the militia in and they were supposed to guard him.
Yeah.
But he got shot. And he got shot from the sheriff's house across the street.
Mm-hmm.
And so Big Jim had a reputation of being an expert marksman. So they just said, well, he's the one that did it.
Right.
Nobody else could have made that shot. And so they kind of just accused him of it. And they really never did solve that. But in the meantime, he had already admitted he shot George.
Right.
So he was going to have to be tried for that.
Right.
But we had a governor's race going on.
Oh boy.
So the governor, when the governor goes out, he gives pardons.
Mm-hmm.
And so word was sent to Big Jim, be in Frankfurt on this day at the governor's office. He's going to give you a pardon for the George Baker
Murder.
Right. So off he goes
To Frankfurt
to
for
get-
his
to
pardon.
get his pardon. And when he gets there, there was a guy by the name of Henry Yancey that was like an assistant to the governor, and another guy named Caleb Powers, who also worked in the governor's office. And so they talked, and then they told him, okay, you come back in the morning at this time, and he'll be here. Now, he was out. The new guy was coming in, William Goble.
Mm-hmm.
And so he goes off. He comes back at his appointed time. Yancey takes him into an office, which is directly where Goble's going to be walking by there.
Yes.
And he says, "You wait right here. You be in this room. You wait right here."
Mm-hmm.
And so he's waiting. Now this is according to him, as I've been told by other family, because I really wasn't born yet. But he always, unto his death, said he did not shoot Goble.
Mm-hmm.
He was sitting in that room waiting for his pardon,
Mm-hmm.
and that he didn't get.
No, he did not. He did not get that at that
But
time.
He was in this room, and as Goble's walking past there to walk into the Capitol to be sworn in as governor, he was shot.
Mm-hmm. The assassination
And so
of
they
Governor
figured
Goble.
out that from the angle and all that stuff, it came from this room, and who was there?
Big Jim
Big
Howard.
Jim, he was there. He's an expert marksman. He's the one that did it.
He has killed Governor Goble.
He's killed the governor. So he went on trial. Also, Caleb Powers and William Yancey went on trial.
Mm-hmm.
And Yancey and Big Jim were kind of like, they decided it was a conspiracy because
Yeah.
he took him in there and then he did it.
Yeah.
Is how they had it figured. So off to Eddyville prison he goes.
Mm-hmm.
For, I believe it was 8 years he stayed in there before a new governor
Yes.
said, "I don't think he's the one that did it. I think Yancey's the one that did it."
Mm-hmm.
I think he put him in that room and he went in the next room and he shot him.
Mm.
But anyway, he pardoned him. He came back to Manchester and sold shoes and apple trees and just lived a quiet life
Mm-hmm.
until his death. But he always, anybody that asked him, he would say, "No, I did not shoot that man. I shot George, but I didn't shoot him."
So he doesn't. He admits to George Baker. He does not
Yes.
admit to
No,
Governor Goble.
no, he always said he did not do that. And his reputation, I mean, everybody, and I've talked to people, different people, not just family, that knew him. And everybody said he was just like such a quiet, kind, even-tempered man.
Mhm.
So nice and a Christian. He didn't drink. He didn't smoke. He didn't use bad language. He was just a really nice man, and had always been.
Mm-hmm.
But they painted him as a evil villain.
Right.
But I like my Aunt Margaret was a little girl when he came out of prison.
Mm-hmm.
And she went to school at Manchester because Daddy Howard was working at the courthouse.
Yes.
Judge and whatever office he was in at the time. And Aunt Margaret said every day when school let out, he would walk down to the school and walk her back up to the courthouse where her daddy was at.
Mm.
He was being really protective of her.
Well, especially in that area.
So, she remembered him as, her her
Her
very,
big bodyguard.
yeah,
Her angel.
yeah. And then, my dad was real young when he died, but he didn't know him a lot. But he was the same way. What he did know, he was just the kindest man. So, anyway, that's what I know about it.
And there it is. So, I thank you, first of all, for coming out and telling this and telling it from your perspective. Because what a lot of people don't know about this is, they don't teach about this in school. And one of the most popular feuds, everyone knows, one of the most popular family feuds in American history is the Hatfields and the McCoys. They don't attribute the Hatfields and McCoys, though, to the quote-unquote bloodiest feud in American history. They attribute it to the Baker-Howard feud. And so this lasted for a very long time, and it involved a whole lot of politics that went beyond just the families that were involved. And yet it's not talked about very much. So I think it's good to talk about it, and I think it's good to get your unique perspective as being so closely related to some key players that were actually involved.
I would add that my grandmother, who my daddy Howard ended up being married to, and all my aunts and uncles, their parents, my grandmother was actually related to the Bakers. Distantly. But she is, in my DNA, there's some of those Boston Bob descendants that have shown up as DNA matches to me. So I know that she really was related
A Baker.
Yeah, so, and two, after the Goebel thing, it kind of, everything died down. And life went on. And in my lifetime and in my working career and social life as well, I have become close friends with the descendants of Boston Bob.
Right.
Working side by side with them and consider them my extremely good friends. And Wiley was one that was with Tom Baker when some of his meanness went on. But there's another Wiley.
Yeah.
That's the sweetest man. He was so nice, so kind, and I loved him and his wife, Jewel. I worked with Jewel. I worked with Jewel's daughter, Ann, and I would consider them some of my very best friends. So, you can bury the hatchet and you can go on and live in peace together and let the past be in the past.
Yes. And that's a beautiful end to somewhat of a tragic story. But I'm sure that, along with other pieces of Clay County history, we will touch base on this in the future in some light. So I thank you for joining us today. And for everyone listening at home, thank you for being with us. And we will see you next time for Tales of the Times, episode 10. And look forward in the near future for more scenes and episodes from the history of Clay. Thank you for listening.